The phone hummed against the concrete like a warning bell. I was halfway under the hood of the Chevy, face smeared with oil and something like a life's worth of patience, when the voice on the other end said words that turned the garage into a different country. "Mr. Mallory, this is Dr. Martinez from Harbor Health. Your test came back positive for chlamydia." The wrench slipped from my fingers and struck the floor with a sound that ricocheted right through my ribs. For a second, I only heard the echo of metal on concrete and the flat, distant thump of my own heartbeat. I wiped my hands on my coveralls, blackened, permanent, and read the note Celia had left on the kitchen counter in a handwriting that had once seemed to know how to soften the storms. "Gone for the weekend. Don't wait up. Love. C." The C at the end leaned like a lie. I called Tank from the boxing gym because 2 a.m. calls are for men who still know how to rage into the dark. "Frankie Duca," Tank said without surprise, and his old sleeve voice had the kind of cracked calm you get from too many late nights and too much truth. "But Eddie, you sure you want to go there?" I was already on the road. Frankie looked like the kind of man that had been thoroughly dismantled by the world and put back together with duct tape and a badge. He met me at Rosie's Diner, cigarette smoke fogging the overhead light, and slid a manila envelope across the formica like he was handing over a bad diagnosis. "Seaside Motel," he said. "Grant Holman, Tom Bradley, Dr. Peterson." He sounded bored and sick at the same time. "And Mona Pierce's got a whole archive. DVDs, photos. She's been filming. Mona, Pilates instructor, social butterfly." The woman who had pressed her hands into my house laughed at our jokes at backyard barbecues and smiled like a neighbor. In the photos, she became something else, a neat, clinical collector, angles of private betrayals stripped of intimacy and repackaged as data. They weren't just sleeping with my wife, they were sleeping with entire reputations. The town's respectable had faces that glittered on glossy paper. Celia in compromising positions with men who signed PTA checks and sat on planning boards. I remember the first time I saw my own bedroom printed out 30 times over and taped to the underside of a lawn chair. The sick, unfunny joke of it all. I will not pretend I didn't want to burn it down then. But I was neither poet nor martyr. I was a mechanic who had learned early that things fall apart, and you either fix them or you let them rot. I fixed stuff people left broken, so I fixed the facts. I photocopied every photo, every DVD thumbnail, every motel receipt. I laminated the dirty text strings Frankie handed me as if they were proofs in a courtroom I intended to build. And then I did what my anger had mapped out. The night I turned my yard into an exhibition of humiliation, the streetlights hung the way a couple years of trust had hung in my chest, pale, uncertain. I stapled the first glossy print to the front door, and then another, and another, until the drip line of our eaves looked like a gallery. The lawn signs, cheap poster board on stakes, swayed in the mild wind like accusations. There, for everyone to see, my wife's face framed in shame. She drove up 30 minutes later, her BMW gliding like she hadn't been the center of the spectacle I'd named. She stopped in the street, hands on the wheel, then moved like someone watching an old film whose plot she had half remembered. Her scream cut clean through the evening. It was loud and jagged and adequate. I left. I let her tear our life down in public. I slept on a cot above Tank's office, the smell of leather and liniment more honest than our kitchen air had been. The next morning our phone flooded. My kids, our neighbors, my own friends who no longer had the courage to look me in the eye. Lucy called furious, anxious, ashamed in the way only 16-year-olds can be. "Dad, what the hell is wrong with you?" Jack, angrier in a lower register, "You're pathetic." It stung, the way truth stings when it is used as a weapon instead of a balm. My kids had already been pushed into a small, cruel theater where people performed grief and damnation with equal enthusiasm. They were choosing the comfortable narratives instead of the complicated ones, and I had to live with that choice. Grant Holman asked to meet. I arrived at Pier 7 and found him polished and flattered by the salt air, like he had been kissed by life. Golden-haired, sun-baked, the kind of man who'd been born practicing the right ways to charm. He greeted me as if we might have coffee and apologies, and then walk away in a gentlemanly haze. He had the decency to be irritated. "What do you want?" he asked, when niceties dried up like old paint. "The truth," I said. "I want you out of my life. Tell your wife, tell everyone, that you pursued my wife. And you give Susan what she wants." I kept my voice level because knocking him out of his shoes would have been satisfying, but not strategic. He laughed at the first part and flinched at the second. But his laugh had the brittle sound of someone who thought in terms of reputations and corporate social capital. Little did he know that the ledger of his life had already been rewritten. What Frankie had shown me over the next week was worse and more methodical than I'd imagined. Mona's files were not random. They were curated and labeled, dates and destinations arranged like the chapters in a book you never asked to read. She had a box for each name and a spreadsheet for every encounter. Payments were recorded in tiny, precise columns. She had receipts. She had passports. She had leverage. She had an agenda that seemed, absurdly, patient. 10 years, 12 years, a slow burn waiting for a match. I started making calls the way a man who's been cornered makes long, spiraling phone calls. I found allies, Tank, Frankie, a girl from community college who knew how to hide a website on the dark parts of the internet. Together we built a small, ugly arsenal, copies of DVDs, scans of bank ledgers, emails that smelled like evidence. We started whispering like conspirators because I knew the thing that frightened those men most was exposure. The men whose reputations fed fancy houses and PTA positions were less tolerant of truth when it landed on their front porches. You could call what I did revenge. Hell, a lot of people did. I called it combustion. I leaked pieces, small, surgical leaks at first, into the town's bloodstream. An email to a local reporter here, a Fed referral there, a batch of prints anonymously slid under the mayor's assistant's door. The reactions were a medicine cabinet of human vices, panic, denial, righteous fury, and, above all, the kind of self-preserving silence that looks the most like agreement. Then Harbor View imploded. On a damp Saturday at the Fall Festival, I walked up onto the bandstand and held the mic like a gavel. Children's laughter chittered around stalls of fried dough. Politicians smiled with eyes that had always cost them something. I didn't speak as a man accused of madness. I spoke as a man with receipts. 12 years of blackmail, I said. A woman who built an empire of shame. Names, dates, documents. I watched as Mona went from queen to mouse in about 2 minutes. She had the kind of composure that vanished when the majority decides to look. Some applauded, some jeered. A man in the crowd I'd known since he was a boy, a dentist who'd once given me a summer job cutting grass, held up his phone and streamed the scene for anyone who wanted to see the town's unraveling live. I watched faces pivot from embarrassed to vindicated to primitive. People like a good scandal. They like to see the powerful brought down because it confirmed an ugly thing. We're not as separate from sin as we pretend. Grant lunged for me. Tom Bradley tried to make a man out of himself with his fists. When the crowd's rage turned kinetic, I fought back, not to win a trophy for brutality, but to demonstrate to anyone watching that being small and hard is different from being cowardly. My hands found the mechanics' rhythm I'd first learned tightening bolts, efficient, honest. They left marks, and the ambulances left scars on reputations. The aftermath smelled like gasoline and rain. The local news teams arrived with cameras that panted like predatory animals. Mona was arrested. Federal agents arrived within the week to look at her ledger of bribes and hinted threats. She had a safety deposit box full of everything from bribery receipts to recorded bedroom trespasses. The FBI's agent Sarah Chen called me the next morning, and her voice was the sharp, clean angle of someone who can turn chaos into law. "You may be the reason we can indict," she said, "but there's a question here. Did you bring this on, or did you stop it?" People called me a villain in articles and myself in the mirror. The editorialists dissected methods. The men who'd been exposed shored themselves up with lawyers and vows. The women who'd been complicit called me a savage, an arsonist, a man who had compounded an already terrible crime with spectacle. My children, meanwhile, watched our family shatter in the columns of the paper they used for art projects and the mockery of a schoolyard. They loved me, but the love was bracketed now by humiliation and an allegiance to simpler stories. He's bad, she's blameless. I thought a lot about whether I'd done the right thing. I thought about the long hours, the missed dinners, the birthday parties watched on my phone. I thought about how men like Frankie and Tank had fewer illusions. I thought about Mona's slow vengeance for something I'd done 12 years earlier, testifying as the one witness who had put a violent man behind bars. That had been the start of all this, a justice placed in a system that, it turned out, breeds its own revenge, and then sells it back in bite-sized cruelty. There are things the town remembers differently. Some say I sacrificed my marriage to expose a rot. Some say I started the fire that destroyed several good people's lives in pursuit of my own pride. The truth is ugly and many-sided, like a coin that cuts both palm and pocket. But I can tell you this, when the federal cases were assembled and prosecutors started to peel back the town's varnish, people who had once laughed at me called and apologized in small, private tones. They wanted to be on the right side of history, or at least off the front page. Celia and I never reconciled. How could we? I did not want a woman who could be captured and sold as evidence. She did not want a man who wanted war with the world she had become. We negotiated custody and division with lawyers who smelled of coffee and sympathy. The kids, Jack and Lucy, picked sides like children pick teams. They will grow up in a place where their parents are a cautionary tale and a study in consequences. My garage still smelled like motor oil and old wages. Tank and Frankie remained, loyal in their own ways, gritty, practical. The gym above which we lived for a while became a classroom of sorts. How to patch a life up after it's been torn. How to tape together a dignity that has been shredded. I took jobs that were honest and small, and felt whole in the doing. People, some of them, came back to the shop. Others stayed away, the way some wounds keep distance as a courtesy. Months later, when the dust had settled and the town's pulse returned to something like normal, I sat one evening with my hands on a mug that had no slogan, and I thought about the arithmetic of justice. Did I do the right thing? I'd started from righteous fury, I won't deny that. But somewhere in the fray, I began to lose the vantage of a moral spectator. I became the instrument of a larger machine, clumsy and precise in turn. The federal indictments came: extortion, bribery, coercion. Mona got a long stretch. Several men took plea deals, and the social architecture they'd used to hide their appetites came down like a poorly built pier. The town had to reckon. With the rot, yes, but also with how quickly curiosity became bloodlust. In some ways, we were all guilty of wanting quick spectacle instead of slow justice. In others, we were victims of an ecosystem where secrets become currency while dignity becomes the casualty. In the end, I did what a man who has been wronged does. I made sure the wrong wasn't a secret. I paid more than I expected. My marriage, my friends, my reputation, but I also watched a crooked little empire collapse under its own weight. My kids are still mine in a way that counts. They are older now, kinder in ways born of observation. Sometimes Lucy brings over a casserole. Jack calls in a voice that has stopped hunting for permission. The Chevy runs a little smoother than it used to. There is no pride in the headline that bears my name. There is, however, an odd kind of relief, the way you feel after clearing out an attic where mold has been hiding for years. The air is different. The house stands with the same beams, but you can breathe in it again. People call me a villain, a hero, a fool. I answer none of those names because they are too neat. What I am is a man who kept score, and when the scoreboard started listing monsters, I lit a match and let the scoreboard burn so someone with a cleaner ledger could start anew. Sometimes at night I sit with my hands in my lap and wonder about the small arithmetic of what we give and take: love, dignity, revenge. I think about the wrench that slipped from my hand when the phone rang and the sound that made the whole world seem to tilt. I think about how a life can be quietly corrupted, one secret at a time, and how sometimes the only remedy is light, harsh, unforgiving light, thrown on the things we prefer to ignore. The town learned that secrets are powerful because they buy silence. I learned that telling the truth can cost everything, but also make things honest. You can be right and broken at the same time. You can also be a man who stands in a greasy garage with a phone in his pocket and decide that whatever it costs, the mirror will no longer lie to him. When the headlines cooled and the summer swelled into a quieter autumn, I went back to work with the same hands and a different sense of claim. I kept an eye on my kids. I kept lunch dates with Tank and Frankie. Sometimes justice is not neat, it is merely necessary. And as for Mona, she got her sentence, and one imagines the hollow reward of revenge is never what the planner dreams. In the small acts of repair, the sanding of a table, the tightening of a stubborn bolt, there was a strange, unbrash redemption. At night, when the garage light is off and the town is sleeping under the same sky that hung over the motel photos, I let the quiet come. It isn't peace, but it is honest. And after a long career of tightening things so they won't break, I have learned that sometimes the hardest, most responsible thing you can do for a town, a marriage, or a life is to refuse to keep feeding the rot.